Hello and welcome to Mr. Sea History. Now behind me is Southampton Harbour and I'm at the beginning of my biggest adventure yet, my odyssey into the RMS Titanic and its sinking. I'll be going across seas and up mountains to find out what we can still see today, any remnants or anything like that, but also some of the key figures, some of the key individuals who played a part in the Titanic. Now, I'm not too interested in telling the story. We all know it was all very nice, going very well, sailing across the Atlantic, and then suddenly it hits an iceberg and it sinks. But I want to just try and find out a little bit more to see what we have in Britain and a little bit elsewhere about the Titanic. Well, it all started here, specifically about where that cruise liner is there, just across the way, towards the blue sort of tower that's there. That is what is now known as Ocean Dock, but in 1912 that was known as Dock 4. And at 12 noon on April the 10th, 1912, the RMS Titanic set sail for its first maiden voyage out of Southampton Harbour, taking 2,240 souls across the Atlantic to the New World to seek their dreams in America. Behind me is the majestic Southwestern house, which at the time of the Titanic was the hotel where the first class passengers stayed before they boarded on the Titanic. There were about 300 first class passengers. Interesting though, not all of them turned up, but those that do turn up are John Jacob Astor, the richest man in the world, along with his pregnant 18-year-old lady friend Madeline. Also Cosmo Duff Gordon and his wife, underwear magnates, W.T. Stead, and Archibald Butt, who was President William Taft's military attaché. So the great and the good, ready for their week of indulgence on the Titanic. Now, many of those first class passengers who had arrived here at Southwestern Hotel would have arrived by train. Now, the Southampton train station nowadays is quite far away from here, but there was a train station right up to the docks, right at the back of Southwestern Hotel. It's no longer a train station, but it is now the car park to the Southwestern Hotel. The remnants still of, but you can still definitely see that this was once a train station. So many of those, it wouldn't just been first class passengers as well, second class others would have taken the train potentially down from London or where else and would have arrived here full of excitement, ready for their journey. There are many Southampton pubs which have connections to the Titanic, but one of the most interesting ones is here, the Grapes. And that specific connection is the Slade brothers, three brothers who had signed on to be firemen on the Titanic. Now they'd got there on the morning of April the 10th, the morning it was leave at 8 a.m. They got onto the boat, they put their stuff in their cabin, and they thought, let's just go for one last drink on dry land before we set off. So they did that, but perhaps one thing led to another, and they suddenly realised, crumbs, we've run out of time, we've got to go. So they ran to the ship, but by the time they got there, the gangplank had been pulled up. They had missed the boat, unlucky them. Or actually were they incredibly lucky, because their stuff went to the bottom of the Atlantic, but they survived. Perhaps this is also maybe a location for anybody who won a wager, won a bet, to get some last minute tickets for the Titanic and rush aboard. I mean, who knows? I am in Lichfield, Staffordshire, and behind me is a statue of the captain of the Titanic, Captain Edward Smith. Now, why Lichfield? It's a bit random, really. I mean, he was born in Hanley in Staffordshire, and Lichfield Cathedral, which you can hear the bells ringing in the background, is the parish church for that area. I think that really is the main connection, so it's a bit random. Anyway, who was he? He was known as the Millionaire's Captain because he captained all of the flagships of the White Star Line, the wonderful things, the Olympic and of course the Titanic and the Britannic. So he was an extraordinarily experienced man. About 32 years he'd been working for White Star Line, and indeed many people would actually change their bookings just so they would sail with him. He was that popular. He was fantastically well paid as well. And on the whole, that 32 years of experience was incident-free, except for, oddly, the year preceding the Titanic, where he had had a few knocks and bumps on various different boats, including quite a bad one in the Olympic, the sister ship of the Titanic, where the boat had hit somewhere in the English Channel, another boat, and had made some holes in the hull, very similar to what the Titanic did, obviously not to such an extent, and had to limp back to Southampton Harbour. So was Captain Smith losing it in his final years? I don't think we can always say that with any certainty, but it's rather interesting. Now, on the night of the 14th of April 1912, he was not actually on the deck, on the bridge, when the iceberg struck. He was in bed, he was in his cabins. First Officer William Murdoch was in charge, but Captain Smith quickly hurried up. He inspected the damage, saw it was going to be pretty bad, and decided to get everyone off. He issued the orders. On the whole, he seems to have behaved very well, very calm, very resolute, very stout within the actual sinking itself. And indeed, he had his megaphone shouting out orders, get to the lifeboat, sort yourself up, that kind of thing. Can any blame be put on Captain Smith for this? I think no. I think that's a bit harsh. A couple of things pointed at him. Some people say he was going too fast. That is not necessarily true. They were not going at full speed. They were going about something like 40 kilometers an hour or something like that, which is not slow, but it's not dangerously fast. It's not reckless or anything like that. They were not trying to get to New York anywhere quicker. So no, I'm not sure we can blame for that. One thing you might possibly be able to say is how he ignored the warnings of ice. Did he necessarily ignore them? No, I don't think so. He knew, he had spoken about them, and he asked the lookouts to make sure they look out. I agree he didn't alter his speed because of going through an ice field, but this was the Titanic. You would, the idea of the Titanic is all those big ships. It would be better just to ram the iceberg. If it rammed it straight on, it would not have sunk. So finally, what happens to poor old Captain Smith? Well, one steward says they see Captain Smith go to the bridge, close the door, he goes down with his ship. And indeed it said that he also said, "Be British, boys, be British," and it actually says that on the bottom of that memorial, the statue there. I'm not so sure that's actually true because nobody saw his death. How do we know he actually said that? But maybe that's a bit of a lie that's been concocted since then. There are also some reports, some people say actually no, they saw Captain Smith in the water afterwards, swimming around, telling people to get into the lifeboats, doing this, still with his megaphone, and he perished down in the waves that way. But all we know is that he did die, he went down with his ship, and he is memorialised, and I think he has been saved from the blame and is seen as a bit more of a heroic figure. Now behind me is the memorial to all heroes of the marine engine rooms, but it was really specifically set up for the Titanic just after the sinking. And I'm here specifically in the city of Liverpool. Why Liverpool? Well, the Titanic never visited Liverpool. However, it was its port of registration. As the boat sank into the Atlantic, at the back of the bow, it would have said Titanic, and underneath it, Liverpool. Why? Well, of course, White Star Line was based in Liverpool, and Liverpool, of course, was this great maritime city. And until only a few years before, most transatlantic crossings had come from Liverpool, only newly into Southampton. And of course, many of the crew also came from Liverpool. Most of them came from Southampton, but many did come from Liverpool, including many of the people in the engineering and the stokers. Now, the stokers were a really interesting group. They're the ones who put the fire, to get the engines going, these extraordinarily fast engines to cross the Atlantic. Brutal, horrible conditions down there. You never see the light of day. You don't get that lovely fresh sea air. It's boiling hot. Interestingly though, quite a few of the stokers actually survived because they were needed to row the lifeboats. They were the strongest arms. So actually you were more likely to die if you were an engineer, doing the electricity or something like that, or the boilers. The stokers, had a slightly better chance of survival. In the Liverpool Maritime Museum, there's a wonderful model of the Titanic. They've also got a uniform of the crew and some crockery. And really interestingly, there's also one of the life jackets. This is Liverpool Cathedral. It hadn't really been built by 1912, a few sort of foundation stones. But actually, if you go in there now, there is a little plaque, a little memorial to the Titanic, the actual ship sailing through. And apparently there is a stained glass window for Captain Smith in there. I did look, there's lots in there, it's huge. So I couldn't quite find it, but here we are, Liverpool remembers the Titanic. This is the rather nice sort of white, bright gravestone of Owen George Allen, and as it says here, shipwrecked on the Titanic and drowned at sea April 14th, 1912, and he was aged just 17 years old. I am in Clewer, just outside Windsor. Now the reason why I've come to see him is he was a third-class passenger, and I wanted to talk about the fate and the experience of the third-class passengers, because there's a bit of myth that's gone on along with the third-class passengers of the Titanic. Conditions on board third class were pretty good for the standard of the day. So they were, yes, they were in dormitories, of course, in the cabins, and they were low down in the ships. But some of these dorms just had 2 people in them, 3 people, 4. They were spotlessly clean as well. Some of the other boats that were going across the Atlantic were far dirtier and nastier than the Titanic. So his experience third class would have been pretty good. Communal areas, a little bit of entertainment, nice dining areas. Food, we would think of it now as being a pretty dull and drab bully beef or whatever they would have, or tinned meat and potatoes, etc. But this was amazing luxury for these poor people. The amount of food that they were given and the quality was far higher than they ever would have experienced. So up until the point of the sinking, they were having the moment of their lives. One idea that's often put forward is that the third-class passengers were discriminated against in terms of the lifeboats. That isn't quite true. Yes, they were very far away, right at the bottom of the ship, therefore couldn't get there quickly. And indeed, there were those gates that went across, but they were there because of the US immigration to stop diseases. It wasn't a Titanic White Star policy. In reality, it was gender which decided whether you would live or die, because there were more women in third class as a proportion survived than men in first class. John Jacob Astor, the richest man in the world, he died, he didn't get on a lifeboat, whereas many women in third class did. It was because it was gender that did it rather than class. This is Albion House, just on the pier head here at Liverpool. And in 1912, this was the headquarters of the White Star Line, the shipping company that owned, built and ran Titanic. Now, what was their shtick? Their shtick was not the same as Cunard. The Cunard building is just there, dare I say, a little bit more grand. But the Cunard, they were all about getting the blue ribbon, speed, the quickest they can get across the Atlantic. The White Star Line were not interested in that. They were interested in luxury. And the first aspect of luxury is deck space. The more space to flaneur and to walk around and to sort of be, the Edwardian gentleman that you want, you need space. Hence why Titanic is so big, and her sister ships, the Olympic and soon to be the Britannic, are also even bigger. They are the biggest ships in the world. But it's not just size, it's also the furnishings, the crockery, everything embossed. But the facilities, there is a squash court on board. There's refrigerators. In these refrigerators, they kept strawberries and salmon. Imagine strawberries in the middle of the Atlantic. White Star is interesting. They actually had a few near misses and crashes and a few little minor sinkings before the Titanic, so didn't have a great safety record. They didn't really survive all the regulations that came in afterwards, like requiring more lifeboats and going some more the more southern routes, etc. And also, it just ultimately didn't survive the reputation of the sinking of the Titanic. By the 1950s, it was bought out by its main rival, Cunard, who I think now have been sold to like Disney or something. They don't exist, White Star Line. And this building was derelict for a few years. Apparently, it's a Titanic-themed hotel now, but I'm not so sure. There is a little model of the Titanic down at the bottom, but there we go. Anyway, the CEO of White Star Line as well was a man called Bruce Isme. Hidden in a corner of Putney Vale Cemetery, in a grave that is all a bit covered in mildew with some lettering that's really hard to read, is in fact the grave of Bruce Isme. Bruce Isme was the managing director of the White Star Line, and it is him who had the vision of the Olympic class boats, the big ships, the Olympic, the Titanic, and then hopefully was going to be the Britannic, these massive luxurious ships that were designed to sail across the Atlantic in extreme luxury, rivaling Cunard. It was Isme whose vision this was. Now, Isme also was on the boat, indeed, and he was a first-class passenger, and he had a lovely time interacting with all the other passengers. But of course, he is wrapped up in controversy because he survives the sinking. He gets into a lifeboat. Now, everybody thought you should go down with your ship. Captain Smith goes down with his ship. The builder of the ship, Thomas Andrews, goes down with it. So when he got back to Britain, and indeed actually as soon as he survived and arrived in New York on the survival boats, people were very critical of it. Why did you not go down with your boats? And indeed, he actually lived the rest of his life in a bit of obscurity with a tremendous survivor's guilt, living with the shame of getting in the lifeboat. I think this is a bit harsh. I mean, don't you? If there's a lifeboat there and the boat is sinking, no matter who you are, you're going to get in it, aren't you? Also, he wasn't taking up anyone's space. He was on collapsible sea. There were 6 spaces still on collapsible sea that could have been with someone else. So he wasn't taking anybody's space, this haul or anything like that. I think it's very, very harsh on the way he has been treated, and the way I think he's slightly forgotten here. So perhaps we maybe should celebrate Isme for his vision of the Olympic class boats and for the slightly tragic life he had after surviving the Titanic. But it's an interesting point about survivor's guilt. There was a lot of people who survived the Titanic who really suffered from the survivor's guilt and, you know, struggled with it afterwards. This is Cherbourg, and about 5 hours after the Titanic left Southampton, it arrived here in northern France. And indeed, there is actually a plaque here to commemorate that fact. Now, it came here to pick up several passengers, but also interesting to drop some off, about 20 passengers just across the channel with Titanic. So rather interesting, those people survived the sailing of the Titanic, which is extraordinary. But yes, it was here to pick up several people. It picked up some very rich and wealthy first-class American passengers. They've been touring the Paris and in Europe, etc., including the unsinkable Molly Brown. She got that nickname because she survived the Titanic, and she later comes on to be very formidable, campaigning for women's votes, running for Congress, etc. She doesn't survive another sinking, but that sort of formidable nature gives her that nickname. But of course, it was here to pick up lots of people from around the world. There were a group of people from Lebanon on the Titanic. There were some people from Armenia escaping the Armenian genocide. And so the Titanic is a story of migration. It is lots and lots of people leaving their homes in Europe, wanting to find a new place, a new dream in America, across the Atlantic and out into the West. Sadly, that dream was taken away from them. This is the grave of John George Phillips, or Jack Phillips as he was known, and he was the radio operator on the RMS Titanic the night it sank, and he died in the sinking. He's in this interesting grave. It has been described as iceberg shaped. I'm not so sure that's deliberate or really what to think about that. He has been given a bit of blame, I think unfairly, about the whole ice warning, how many ships were giving warnings about ice going on. He had collated them and he had passed them on to the captain. Whether they were ignored or not is up to debate. The one thing you can say is he got quite a few warnings amongst other messages, and all of these got plumped together within them. So maybe they got missed, perhaps, amongst them all. I think one thing to say for poor old Jack Phillips, the radios were really in their infancy in 1912, so they're not the most reliable. Indeed, he was trying to communicate with other ships once the iceberg had struck. And some of those ships had their radios switched off or just didn't have them and stuff, things like that. So that's a bit unfair. And the only other thing to say is he sent out the distress call, which is an interesting point because he sent out one called CQD, Come Quickly Distress, which was the old one. But the new one that had just come in was SOS. And so he sent out both. Was there confusion? Was there different? Did not people understand them? I don't know, because the Carpathia did take 4 hours and the ships that were nearer didn't get the message or whatever. But he dies in the sinking, unfortunately. Here, Jack Phillips. I'm currently sat in a Wetherspoons, specifically the Wetherspoons in Darlington, the W.T. Stead, or the William Stead. Now, why am I here? Well, W.T. Stead was a victim on the Titanic. He was a passenger. Indeed, he was a first-class passenger, and he might have been potentially one of the most famous people on the Titanic. He was a newspaper man. He was actually a journalist, and he'd started out his journalist life here in Darlington, hence why he's so famous. He was born elsewhere in County Durham, but came here, and he was a writer on the Northern Echo, and he wrote a very famous exposure about child prostitution, and indeed he promoted the campaign to push the age of consent up to 16, so significant with that. And then he was one of the key writers, the journalist at the time, and politicians feared him and celebrities feared him or loved him because it was in his hands the ability to make your career or potentially break your career. But he worked on good social justice stuff, and indeed there is a statue of him here in this Wetherspoons highlighting his social reforms. He was a voice for the poor. With that, he went on the Titanic. He was heading to America for a peace congress, of all things, and he was asleep, or reading at least, maybe perhaps in his cabin, when the moment the iceberg struck. There are some reports that suggest that he was with John Jacob Astor, the billionaire, the richest man in the world at the time, another extremely famous person. He was helping women and children onto the lifeboats, and indeed was at the last moment was clinging to a lifeboat before succumbing to the sea. His body has never been recovered, but he's memorialised here, and there's a plaque in town. But most importantly, he's memorialised here in the Wetherspoons, and indeed there are actually 3 Wetherspoons named after Titanic passengers. One here, the William Stead, of course, in Darlington. There's the Wallace Hartley in Colne, and then there's the Eva Hart, who actually was a survivor, and her Wetherspoons is in Essex. I'm in Hollybrook Cemetery in Southampton, and this is the grave of Frederick Fleet. Now on his grave he's got a picture of the Titanic, and Frederick Fleet was one of the men who was in the bird's nest. He was a lookout, and indeed he was one of the lookouts who was there at 11:40 on April the 14th, 1912, when the Titanic ran into the iceberg. He is the man who phoned down to the bridge to say, "Iceberg right ahead." And the person in charge of the ship at the time was First Officer Murdoch. Captain Smith was in his room. Was he asleep? Whatever the case. And Murdoch decided to turn a hard left. Now lots of questions have come from this. One of them was binoculars. Indeed, Frederick Fleet, when he was interviewed afterwards, said if only they'd been given binoculars, he might have been able to see it. That might possibly be true. The other issue, of course, is that it was a still very calm, no reflections, no waves at all going near the iceberg, which helped him to see it. And it was a moonless night as well. So it was really hard to see the iceberg. A lot of people said, how did you miss it? But it's quite clear. And I don't know if the binoculars would have necessarily helped him, because binoculars, yes, they magnify the view, but they narrow it. You can't see the horizon and the widespread that he might possibly have needed. Frederick Fleet was put in command of one of the lifeboats and so survived, but I think he did suffer a lot from survivor's guilt, and indeed maybe he thought he played a part. He lived in the 1960s, but sadly he took his own life in his late 70s. Was he riddled with guilt? I mean, we don't perhaps know, but a sad tale to an interesting part of this. Here it's worth also talking about the point that if the Titanic had actually hit the iceberg dead on, rather than turn to the port, it might have and probably would have survived. The first 4 compartments would have crumpled, but through Thomas Andrews' design, that actually might have been okay. It might have just only flooded the front section. It might have been allowed to limp on. It probably would have survived longer for the boats to come to save it. As it happened though, Murdoch, the first officer, turned too hard to the port, and then it skimmed the iceberg, yes, fine, but underneath the iceberg was a ledge, and essentially it cut open the Titanic like a can opener, and too many compartments were flooded and it sank. Now down this quiet cul-de-sac in Richmond upon Thames, with the river just behind that shed there, is a sort of peeling old plaque to an extraordinary figure of the Titanic story, Commander Charles Herbert Lightoller, or as he was known on the Titanic, the second Officer Lightoller. He was just down in the chain of command from Captain Smith. Now, he's a very interesting figure, slightly controversial as well, because he was off duty when the boat sank. Murdoch, the first officer, he's the one who made the decision to turn, but Lightoller spurred into action when the iceberg struck, and he commanded the lifeboats on the port side. Murdoch was on the starboard side. Now Lightoller was famous for always being very strict to the rules and following orders through. And one order he followed to the letter was Captain Smith's order of women and children first on the lifeboat. But his interpretation was women and children only. So on Murdoch's starboard side, women and children came on first, then he led on some men. But Lightoller, he led on all the women and children, and then any men that were left around, he said, nope, sorry, you can't get on board, no men whatsoever. He lowered the lifeboat, sometimes just half full, because he said no men were to be allowed. A controversial decision that cost a lot of lives, but was he just following orders? Was it a misinterpretation? Was it Captain Smith should have been clearer? Now, amazingly, Lightoller survives the sinking. He was able to grab hold of the underside of a collapsible lifeboat, clung on until he was rescued by the Carpathia. So an amazing story there. It gets more amazing because flash forward to 1940 and Lightoller is at an amazing naval escapade again, this time Dunkirk. He takes a yacht called the Sundowner across the channel and rescues 130 men from the beaches of Dunkirk. So Lightoller had a key part to play in Titanic and Dunkirk. What an extraordinary figure. I'm in the beautiful Lancashire town of Colne in the Colne Valley, and I'm at the cemetery here to find a very significant Titanic grave. So it's actually quite hard to find the grave I'm looking for, and it's quite a lot of steep hills as well. Well, I found it. This is the grave to Wallace Hartley, the leader of the band of musicians on the Titanic. There were various different musicians on the Titanic playing various different bits, and there are lots of memorials around the UK, but I wanted to come here because Wallace Hartley really is one of the real famous figures of the Titanic, and an amazing story that came out of it. So the story is that as the boat was sinking, the musicians played on. As the lifeboats were loading, they played the music, and they were playing jolly music to keep people calm, as it were. And as the ship was sinking, and the water was lapping up, they were there until the end. Many of the eyewitnesses say they played on right till the end, and Wallace Hartley was the leader of this. Incredible bravery. The other thing as well, they don't quite know what the last song we played is, but the general consensus is that the last song that the musicians played was "Nearer, My God, to Thee," and here on Wallace Hartley's grave is the music and the lyrics to that amazing hymn. Also, he was the lead violinist. There is a violin at the bottom of here as well, of this grave. So it's a rather precious thing. Now, what's interesting about Wallace Hartley as well, his body was discovered in the water afterwards, clutching still his violin. He had frozen to death, unfortunately. But he came back here to Colne. He was a hero of this part of Lancashire, and his funeral was attended by thousands, and there was a procession through the streets, and he has this rather majestic grave here. Interestingly, about only a few years ago, that violin that was clutching in his hands was sold at auction for about £1 million. Anyway, here he is in this wonderful bucolic setting, a really fitting place for an amazing story and an amazing person. This is Southampton City Hall, and inside there are two interesting Titanic connections. One is the Book of Remembrance there that gets turned every so often, but also there's a plaque made from one of the spare blades of the rudder of the Titanic to the postal workers of the Titanic. Now, the postal workers were quite unique on the Titanic because their job was essentially to pick up the post in Southampton, guard it whilst on the ship, deliver it when it gets into New York in case there's money or specific things in there. It was their job to assure safe passage of that post. Of course, it sinks, and actually all 5 of the postal workers do die in the end, protecting their packages, whether wanting to see if they can get the mail onto lifeboats. Unfortunately, they failed. So yet more victims that we don't necessarily hear about, but played a significant part. This rather imposing angel is the memorial to the engineers of the Titanic here in Southampton. Now, after the sinking, Southampton was a stricken city because out of the 1,500 people who had died, 688 were crew, the vast majority of which came from this city, from Southampton. And this memorial specifically is to the engineers. Now, these are key people. These are the people who kept the pumps going as the ship was sinking, getting the pumps out, all the water out. They kept the lights on. Crucially, the lights stayed on to Titanic right to the point when it split in two. Incredible, down to these engineers staying at their posts and ultimately going down with the ship. So really, really heroic people. Now, there's one very particular interesting name here, that of Thomas Andrews. Thomas Andrews was the managing director of Harland & Wolff, the shipyard in Belfast where the Titanic was built. And he was the chief designer of the Titanic. It was his ship, and he was there on the maiden voyage. Now, he had obviously designed this ship to have various different compartments within it, so that if it was struck by something or it hit something, one compartment would flood, maybe 1 or 2 or 3, and the ship could survive if 5 or so of these compartments were breached. The problem is, and this was a foresight perhaps, but it was just the standard of design at the time, the bulkheads of these compartments did not meet the top level. So theoretically, the water could spill over if too many flooded in. But Thomas Andrews was there on that fateful night, and he organised a lot of the lifeboats, etc. And of course, he goes down with the ship as well. Well, sadly, the Titanic never did return here to Southampton Harbour, but I have. Now, why has the Titanic had such a resonance over the years? It's a horrendously tragic event. Obviously, 1,500 people die. It's awful. One of the biggest maritime disasters ever. But why is it stuck in the consciousness so much? I think obviously the tales of the rich and the poor that we've looked at, obviously films have played a part of it. But I think it's a really interesting metaphor, Titanic, actually. It's a loss of innocence from this Edwardian period of top hat and tails and cigar after dinner. That disappears and it's replaced by iron and industry and ultimately war. The First World War is 2 years later. And the grinding churn of the 20th century. This is something that's been lost with the Titanic. Anyway, thank you so much for sticking with me on that. I have had a wonderful time going up and down the country looking at what I can find about the Titanic. Please do let me know what you think, as always. Please don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you on the next one.